The night learned her name before it learned her crime. It passed from mouth to mouth beneath crystal chandeliers, slipping between gloved fingers and painted fans, carried by the hush that follows a cruelty too exquisite to deny. She stood at the edge of the ballroom as if placed there by design, a living caution stitched into pale silk, her posture immaculate, her face still. The music faltered, not because the violins aired, but because attention had shifted. Shame has a gravity of its own, and it drew every gaze toward her with merciless precision. She had arrived unescorted, a fact noted instantly, catalogued like a flaw in a gem otherwise fit for display. Invitations were not rescinded in ink, they were revoked in glances. Women turned their shoulders with apologetic smiles that never reached the eyes. Men assessed her with detached curiosity reserved for scandal and specimens. Somewhere, someone laughed too loudly, and the sound cut sharper than any whispered insult. She felt it all without flinching, for she had learned long ago that dignity, once cracked, must be held with deliberate care. They said she was bound to betrayal, though no one agreed upon particulars. Some claimed blood had been spilled for her sake, others that she had spilled it herself. There were murmurs of forged letters and a brother disgraced. The truth had been flattened into something simpler: she was forbidden. In a world governed by lineage and restraint, nothing terrified society more than a woman who refused to vanish quietly. Her name, when spoken, was accompanied by a pause, a soft inhalation, as though the speaker feared contamination. Yet she did not beg for absolution. She held her chin level, her hands folded, her gaze trained upon a distant mirror where she could see herself reflected as others saw her now. The girl who once belonged had been erased. In her place stood a woman marked, but unbowed, and the distinction unsettled them. It was then that the Duke entered the room, though no announcement preceded him. He required none. Authority moved with him as naturally as breath, and the crowd parted by instinct rather than instruction. He was a figure shaped by expectation, tall and unhurried, his expression composed in that particular manner learned by men who are never permitted to be careless. Titles clung to him like tailored cloth, invisible yet unmistakable. He observed the assembly with practiced disinterest, offering acknowledgments without intimacy. His presence restored the music, steadied the room, reminded everyone of their places. Everyone, that is, except her. For reasons he could not have named, his attention snagged upon the stillness at the margin. While others strained to distance themselves from the stain of her reputation, he noted the restraint with which she endured it. There was no theatrical misery in her bearing, no plea for rescue. She stood as one who had already survived the worst, and that quiet resilience unsettled him more than tears ever could. Their eyes met by accident, or so it might have appeared to anyone watching closely enough to witness the exchange and not understand it. It was a moment no longer than a breath, yet something in it shifted, like a door unlatched. She did not look away. Neither did he. In that suspended instant, the whispers faltered again, sensing perhaps that they had been overheard by a future that did not yet know its own name. The Duke was well acquainted with scandal. He had seen it consume lesser houses, devour promising heirs, reduce fortunes to ash. He had been taught that proximity was complicity, that mercy was weakness, that affection must always be measured against consequence. And yet, as he regarded her, he felt no urge to turn aside. Instead, an unfamiliar recognition stirred, as though he were glimpsing a truth his education had neglected to warn him against. She recognized him immediately. Everyone did. To be seen by him was to be weighed by history itself. She expected condemnation, or worse, indifference sharpened into cruelty. What she did not expect was curiosity unmarred by judgment. It unsettled her carefully arranged composure, sending a tremor through the armor she wore so well. She had survived betrayal, exile, and erosion of reputation. She was unprepared for being noticed as something other than a cautionary tale. Around them, society resumed its motion, reassured by the illusion that nothing had changed. The violins swelled, gowns brushed marble, and conversation crept back into comfortable grooves. Yet the space between them remained charged, an invisible fault line running through the polished floor. He took a step closer, then another, each movement precise, deliberate, as though approaching a precipice he fully intended to stand upon. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to be irreproachable. Protocol demanded acknowledgement, nothing more. What he offered instead was a formal inclination of the head, measured and exact, the sort reserved for equals. It was a gesture so small that many missed it entirely. Those who saw felt its impact like a sudden chill. The forbidden woman had been recognized. The Duke had chosen to see her. Her breath caught, traitorous and swift, before she mastered it. She returned the bow with equal composure, though her pulse betrayed her. In that exchange lay no promise, no declaration, only a mutual defiance of expectation. Yet it was enough. Whispers reignited, sharper now, edged with disbelief. Lines had been crossed without a word spoken, and the room sensed it. As he straightened, his gaze lingered a moment longer than courtesy required, and in that fleeting interval she understood that the night had not finished with her. Shame had introduced her, but something else had answered. The Duke turned away at last, leaving behind a silence that pressed upon her like a held breath, and she knew, with a clarity both terrifying and bright, that her ruin had just learned her name, and her redemption had seen her face. Morning light crept across the city like an indiscreet witness, illuminating what the night had dared to begin. By noon, the bow had become a rumor, and by dusk it was a scandal dressed in silk. Carriages paused too long before her door, servants lingered in corridors, and invitations arrived only to be withdrawn with apologies too polished to conceal their fear. She felt society tightening around her again, not as punishment now, but as warning. To be seen by the Duke had altered the shape of her disgrace, transforming it from something pitiable into something dangerous. He did not seek her, at least not openly. That was the first surprise. Instead, his presence brushed against her life like a persistent echo. At the circulating library, a volume she had long requested appeared on the counter, marked paid in a hand she recognized from public decrees. At the florist's, winter roses arrived without card or signature, their stems wrapped in paper too fine for casual generosity. Each offering was discreet, defensible, and unmistakable. They were tokens that asked nothing, yet demanded everything of her restraint. She told herself to refuse them. She even rehearsed the words, standing before the mirror in the quiet of her rooms, practicing a firmness she did not feel. Yet the roses were fragrant with defiance, and the book bore marginal notes written in a disciplined script that betrayed attention, not ownership. He had not claimed her. He had noticed her. The distinction mattered more than she wished to admit. Society noticed, too. Women who once ignored her now studied her with sharpened interest, curiosity edging toward envy. Men speculated more freely, their judgments tinged with resentment rather than contempt. The shift unsettled her. She had learned how to endure scorn. Fascination was a far more perilous terrain. Every kindness extended toward her now carried a question. Every glance weighed against his. The Duke remained a figure of restraint, his conduct beyond reproach. He continued to attend council meetings, to host dinners of impeccable propriety, to speak of policy and inheritance with the calm authority expected of him. Yet his eyes sought her in crowded rooms, finding her with unerring precision. When they crossed paths, he offered nothing more than conversation measured to the second, his tone courteous, his words unremarkable. Only the timing betrayed him. He always arrived when her endurance was thinnest, when retreat seemed most tempting. Their exchanges were brief, yet each left an imprint. He spoke of weather and literature, of the fatigue of duty and the necessity of endurance. She replied with equal care, her sentences composed to reveal nothing of the turmoil beneath. Still, something passed between them, unspoken and undeniable, like heat beneath ash. He never mentioned the whispers. She never thanked him for the gifts. Silence became their shared language, dense with intention. The scandal ripened quickly. A matron known for her vigilance remarked upon the frequency of their proximity. A cousin of the Duke's remarked upon it more loudly. By the end of the week, speculation had hardened into accusation. It was said she had ensnared him, that her disgrace was strategic rather than tragic. Old stories were resurrected and embellished, their cruelties refined by repetition. She felt the familiar weight of judgment settle upon her shoulders, heavier now for being entwined with his name. Pressure arrived from more official quarters as well. He was reminded, gently at first, of the expectations bound to his title. A marriage had been discussed, alliances hinted at. His mother's letters grew longer, her concern couched in affection but edged with command. He read them with composure, then placed them aside without response. The omission was noted. She attempted withdrawal then, driven by a fierce, belated protectiveness. She declined invitations she suspected he might attend. She altered her routes through the city, her hours of appearance. When the roses came again, she returned them unopened. When another book arrived, she sent it back with a note of polite refusal, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest. She would not be the instrument of his undoing, whatever her heart might whisper in rebellion. He did not press her, which was perhaps the boldest choice of all. Days passed without sign or token, and she told herself she was relieved. Yet absence proved more unsettling than presence. The city felt dimmer, its cruelties louder. When she encountered him at last, it was in a public gallery, their meeting unavoidable. He regarded her with an expression she had not seen before, something like concern stripped of authority. They spoke briefly, the air between them taut. He acknowledged her note without reproach, only a quiet understanding that pierced her resolve more sharply than anger might have. As they parted, he paused, then performed a small, unmistakable act. He offered her his arm, openly, in full view of the watching room. It was an invitation weighted with consequence, impossible to misinterpret. She hesitated, the world holding its breath with her, and in that suspended moment she knew the scandal had not reached its height. It had merely found its voice. He did not wait for her answer. The gesture itself was the answer, a line drawn where none had been permitted before. Murmurs swelled, restrained no longer, and she felt the weight of 100 judgments press against her back. To take his arm would be to accept their sentence. To refuse would be to deny the truth awakening within her. Her fingers trembled, then stilled. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the Duke, but the man standing willingly at the edge of loss. In that instant, she understood that every token, every silence, had been a rehearsal for this choice. The room faded. Only the space between their hands remained, charged with promise and peril alike. Somewhere beyond the gallery doors, Destiny leaned closer, waiting to see whether she would step forward or let everything burn in deliberate silence tonight. They met away from the gaze that had learned to sharpen itself upon them, in a library long abandoned by fashion and preference. The hour was late enough to excuse solitude, early enough to pretend innocence. Rain traced the windows in thin, wavering lines, blurring the city beyond into shadow and suggestion. Candlelight breathed across the spines of old volumes, illuminating titles long forgotten, as though history itself had withdrawn here to listen. She stood near the hearth, hands clasped tightly, her composure frayed by anticipation rather than fear. He arrived without ceremony, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. The Duke who ruled rooms with a glance seemed altered in this private refuge, his authority tempered by something rawer, less rehearsed. He did not approach her at once. Instead, he removed his gloves slowly, placing them upon a table as though disarming himself of rank. The gesture struck her with unexpected force. This was no longer a public game of courtesy. This was an invitation into truth. Silence held them first, dense and weighted. She felt the confession pressing against her ribs, aching to be released, yet terrified of what freedom might cost. He broke the quiet at last, his voice lower than she had ever heard it, asking not for explanation, but for permission. The courtesy of it nearly undid her. She nodded once, a small surrender that felt immense, and with that motion the balance shifted between them. She spoke carefully at first, each word measured as though still subject to judgment. She told him of the betrayal, stripped now of embellishment. It had not been ambition, nor recklessness, nor seduction as society preferred to believe. It had been loyalty misplaced, trust given too freely to those who wore affection like disguise. She spoke of blood ties turned brittle, of a decision made in silence to protect another, and of the ruin that followed when truth proved inconvenient. Her voice did not break, but something in her eyes dimmed as she reached the end. He listened without interruption, his attention unwavering. There was no shock in his expression, no triumph at discovering her vulnerability. Instead, His features settled into a grave stillness, as though absorbing not just her story, but the weight she had carried alone. When she finished, she expected questions. What she received was something rarer. He apologized, not for himself, but for the world that had demanded her suffering as proof. That apology cracked something open between them. He spoke then, slowly, choosing honesty with the same care others chose advantage. He told her of a life governed by inheritance rather than desire, of affection rationed as resource rather than gift. He had learned early that love was dangerous, a weakness to be managed. Duty had shaped him so thoroughly that he had mistaken obedience for virtue. Meeting her, he confessed, had unsettled that certainty. She had stood where judgment demanded collapse, and remained standing. He had recognized in her a courage his titles had never required of him. The rain intensified, striking the glass with new urgency, as though echoing the urgency gathering in the room. They stood closer now, the space between them narrowed not by intention, but by gravity. She felt the warmth of him, the reality of his presence undoing weeks of restraint. When he spoke her name, it was without title or distance, and she felt it settle upon her like a vow neither had yet spoken. She warned him then, fiercely, of what knowledge cost. To choose her was to invite scrutiny that would not relent. She would not be the shadow that followed him into disgrace. Her words were sharp with fear disguised as resolve. He did not contradict her. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, placing it into her open palm without explanation. It was his signet ring, heavy with lineage, unmistakable. Not a gift, but a trust. Her breath stilled. To hold it was to hold his name, his authority, his risk. She tried to return it, her fingers curling back instinctively, but he closed her hand gently, firmly. He told her that power meant nothing if it could not be chosen. That the ring had been given to him without consent, but trust must be offered freely. He did not ask her to accept his protection. He offered her his vulnerability. The moment stretched, fragile and incandescent. She felt the enormity of it pressing against her resolve, tempting her toward hope she had sworn never to claim. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor, distant yet unmistakable. Voices followed, searching, purposeful. Reality intruded, sharp and insistent. She looked toward the door, then back at him, the ring still warm in her grasp. He met her gaze with calm intensity, unflinching. Whatever came next, whatever judgment waited beyond that threshold, had already been transformed. In the quiet before discovery, before consequence, they stood suspended between secrecy and exposure. She closed her fingers around the ring at last, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgment. The footsteps drew nearer, and with them the certainty that confession had altered nothing safely, but everything irrevocably. The reckoning arrived without drama, which was its cruelest quality. It came in sealed letters, in summons delivered with impeccable courtesy, in silences that grew louder than accusation. By the time she was called to attend the council chamber, the outcome had already been rehearsed in whispers. He was to explain himself. She was to be absent, as though her erasure might restore order. He refused that condition immediately. When they stood together beneath the carved ceilings of authority, the room felt smaller than any ballroom they had ever endured. Faces familiar from portraits and power regarded them with composed severity. Her presence was an offense made visible. His composure was the final provocation. They listed consequences as one might list expenses, calmly, precisely, with practiced detachment. Titles could be revoked, inheritances reallocated, names quietly removed from ledgers that remembered only obedience. A future had been prepared for him, and it did not include defiance. When he was asked to speak, the room leaned forward, eager for repentance. What they received instead was certainty. He did not raise his voice, nor did he soften it. He spoke as a man accustomed to command, yet newly awakened to choice. He acknowledged the cost without apology. He named her without shame. He stated, plainly and irrevocably, that he would not separate his life from hers. If his title required her absence, then the title was insufficient. A murmur rippled, sharp with disbelief. She stood motionless, the world narrowing to the sound of her own breath. She had expected resistance, perhaps negotiation. She had not expected devotion declared with such composure. The council pressed harder, invoking legacy, invoking blood. They reminded him of generations built upon sacrifice. He listened, then answered with a truth that stilled them. Sacrifice chosen freely, he said, was honor. Sacrifice demanded by fear was merely tradition's cowardice. He removed the signet ring and placed it upon the table. The sound it made was small, final, devastating. With that motion, he relinquished more than inheritance. He surrendered the future written for him in ink older than memory. She moved then, before restraint could reclaim her. Her protest broke free, fierce and trembling. She told him she would not be the cost of his ruin. He turned toward her fully, the room dissolving from his attention. He answered softly, yet with a resolve that quieted her fear. He told her she was not his ruin, but his refusal to live unawakened. If redemption existed, it began with choosing truth over comfort. Silence followed, heavy with consequence. The judgment was rendered without ceremony. He was dismissed, divested, and unprotected. She felt the blow land not upon him, but upon herself. Outside, the air tasted sharper, colder. They stood together on the steps, stripped of illusion. He had lost everything that made him powerful. He had gained something infinitely more dangerous. She looked at him and saw no regret. Only resolve, fierce and unornamented. Around them, onlookers whispered already, reshaping the story to suit their comfort. He took her hand openly. The gesture carried no secrecy now, only consequence. She felt the finality of it settle into her bones. Ahead lay exile of a different sort, a life without shield or script. As they descended the steps together, she realized the world had not ended. It had merely turned toward them, watchful and unforgiving. In the distance, bells began to toll, marking an hour that belonged to neither of them before. She tightened her grip upon his hand, aware that the declaration had been made, but the reckoning was not complete. Beyond the square waited the quieter consequences, the lives that would measure their choice more cruelly than any counsel ever could. She lifted her gaze to him, searching for doubt. There was none. What she found instead was anticipation tempered by gravity. The future had not yet pronounced its verdict, but it had been challenged, and that alone altered its course. They walked on, unaware of who might follow, or who might betray them next. The city seemed to lean closer, hungry for aftermath. She understood then that love had not saved them. It had merely made escape impossible. As the bells faded, she felt the first tremor of fear give way to something steadier. Whatever remained would demand more than declarations. It would demand endurance. And somewhere ahead, beyond devotion and disgrace alike, waited the final cost they had yet to name. She inhaled deeply, aware that the moment of choice had ended, and the era of consequence had begun. Behind them, doors closed with deliberate weight. Before them, the street stretched long and uncertain. He squeezed her hand once, a promise without ornament. She returned the pressure, feeling the fragile solidity of what they had claimed. This was not triumph. It was commencement. And as they disappeared into the narrowing street, unseen forces began to gather, patient and precise. The declaration had shattered the present. What followed would test whether love could survive its own victory. She sensed it even then, a quiet certainty beneath the fading bells. The reckoning was only beginning. Night would fall soon, and with it decisions made beyond candlelight and vows. She tightened her coat against the cold, knowing warmth would no longer be guaranteed. Yet she did not release his hand. That choice, at least, remained hers. Above them, the sky darkened, indifferent to titles lost or hearts laid bare. Somewhere within that indifference lay the test they had yet to face. She lifted her chin, prepared to meet it. Beside her, he walked without looking back. Together, they stepped forward into a future that had already marked them. Behind their joined shadows, consequence followed patiently, waiting for the moment to demand more. Neither yet knew how high the price would rise. But both understood, with quiet certainty, that it would be paid. The declaration had bound them. The reckoning would decide what remained. And fate waited, unhurried, to answer their defiance fully. Irony followed them into obscurity, quiet as snowfall. Removed from the capital's brilliance, they settled where names carried less weight than conduct. Mornings arrived without ceremony, light touching worn floors, hands, and shared silence. He learned the labor of ordinary hours, the ache of effort unsoftened by privilege. She learned the fragile freedom of being unobserved. Yet consequence lingered. Letters arrived unsealed, bearing debts unpaid, loyalties withdrawn, and warnings shaped like concern. Redemption did not announce itself. It waited, patient, watching whether love would endure when nothing remained to protect it. Time measured them without mercy. Still hope breathed quietly. Seasons turned, and with them the language of their bond changed. Passion softened into vigilance, devotion into choice renewed daily. He carried loss with grace earned, not inherited. She carried memory without bitterness, though scars spoke privately. Society forgot them unevenly, misplacing outrage before curiosity. Yet history watched more closely. In quiet villages, his counsel steadied disputes. Her kindness stitched households together. Redemption arrived not as absolution, but as usefulness. They were needed. That necessity rebuilt dignity slowly, until ruin felt less like punishment and more like preparation. It prepared them for trials ahead together. That history had not finished. But redemption demands proof, and proof invites danger. When illness struck the region, fear returned quickly. Authority absent, neighbors turned to him instinctively. He organized aid, rationed supplies, negotiated passage through flooded roads. She tended the sick without rest, her name spoken with gratitude instead of disdain. Word traveled outward, inevitably inward. Officials remembered the duke they dismissed. An offer arrived, discreet and conditional. Restoration, if he abandoned her. The temptation was precise, surgical, and timed when exhaustion weakened resolve. It arrived sealed with authority, carrying promises echoing old power, and threatening silence if refused. Consequences hovered near. Again now. She read the letter first, hand steady, heart unguarded. She understood the bargain instantly. Redemption offered to him required her erasure. She gave the letter back without tears, only certainty. He watched her carefully, searching for sacrifice. What he found was trust. He refused without reply. The messenger left, astonished. That refusal completed his transformation. Power no longer tempted him. Love had become alignment, not rescue. In that moment, redemption ceased to be outcome and became identity. It anchored their future beyond permission or reward. History might forget titles, but it remembers choices. Made under pressure. Without witnesses. Or regret. Years later, as firelight softened their faces, she reflected on ruin's strange mercy. What destroyed their past had preserved their souls. He reached for her hand, unchanged in that single devotion. Outside, the world continued its cycles of judgment and forgetting. Inside, meaning endured. Redemption, she realized, was not forgiveness granted by others, but coherence within oneself. Love had not restored what was lost. It had revealed what could not be taken. Beyond the window, dawn approached quietly, promising nothing except continuation, and that was enough. Their story ended, yet meaning carried forward. Like embers enduring. After flame fades. The city eventually spoke their names again, altered by distance and time. Some called him foolish, others brave. Few understood the distinction no longer mattered. She walked streets unrecognized, yet unafraid, her posture no longer defensive. They had crossed beyond spectacle. When letters arrived praising his former leadership, he burned them unopened. The man he had been belonged to history, not longing. Together they shaped a quieter legacy, teaching children, settling disputes, choosing patience. Redemption matured slowly, like wine forgotten until needed. It sustained them when memory tried returning pain. Without apology or defense. Time confirmed their peace. At last. One evening, News arrived of the old council's dissolution. Power shifted, faces replaced, traditions rewritten quietly. She watched him read the notice without reaction. Vindication arrived too late to matter. Redemption, once earned, resented recognition. He folded the paper and placed it aside. They shared a look shaped by shared history, not triumph. What they had endured no longer demanded audience. Love, tested and weathered, required no witnesses. The past loosened its grip. In its absence, possibility expanded, unburdened and free. Freedom startled them with its gentleness, and demanded careful stewardship. Neither wished to squander it. Ever again. Not now. Their redemption was never recorded formally, yet it endured through influence unseen. Kindness echoed outward, altering paths quietly. Those they helped remembered integrity rather than titles. She found peace in anonymity, strength in chosen simplicity. He found purpose unchained from lineage. Together they proved a radical truth society resists, that worth survives disgrace. When storms came, they faced them side by side, unarmored but aligned. Love remained deliberate, renewed through action rather than vow. Ruin had stripped illusion. What remained was real. It required daily courage and mutual forgiveness. That practice never ended. Nor did devotion. Between them always. Enduring. As years layered quietly, redemption lost its sharpness and became texture. It lived in routines, in shared glances, in laughter unguarded. She sometimes recalled the ballroom, the weight of shame. It felt distant, unreal. He remembered power similarly, as something heavy once worn. Neither desired return. Their story, once scandal, now resembled myth, retold inaccurately, softened by distance. They did not correct it. Truth belonged to them alone. That privacy was victory enough. It preserved love without intrusion or performance. Memory could wound, yet also instruct. They learned discernment, choosing which pasts to keep, and which to release. Forever intentionally. In the end, redemption did not crown them. It accompanied them. It walked beside love, uncelebrated it, resilient. She stood at the window one final morning, watching light arrive, unchanged. He joined her, presence steady. They had been ruined, yes, but never erased. What survived had chosen them in return. Beyond the glass, the world waited, indifferent and vast. They did not fear it. Together they stepped forward, unremarkable and unbroken, carrying a legacy no title could bestow, and no judgment could diminish. This was their triumph, quiet and complete. Love endured beyond consequence. That was redemption. At last earned. Fully.